It's now my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Needham from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She's currently Senior Advisor in the North Asia Division, but was more recently Consul General in Guangzhou. And she has deep familial relationships also with China because her father was born in Guangzhou. Mother was born in Guangzhou, father in Hong Kong. I got that wrong. But anyway, it's a pleasure very much to hear from Rebecca again on, as we've just heard now from the Councillor, with the confirmation of the visit of the Premier. Maybe we could hear a bit more about what this year might entail without you breaking too many confidences.
Thank you, Fran, and thank you, Councillor Zhang. Ladies and gentlemen, Happy New Year of the Rooster. 女士们、先生们，大家祝你今年大吉。So I just wanted to sort of add a point about my relationship with Councillor Zhang, actually. Started before he came to New Zealand the first time. It was when I was on my first posting to Beijing in the early 90s. And I was a junior desk officer in the embassy, and Zhang Fan was a junior desk officer in the Ministry of Commerce, as it's now called. So it's somewhat fitting and also delightful that we are back here in New Zealand at the sort of midpoint, hopefully, of our careers, talking about New Zealand-China relationships. I was going to reflect actually on some of the massive developments and growth that have occurred between our two countries in recent years, and I will still do that, but in a way I want to really just pick up from where Zhang Fan left off. There have obviously been, there's been a lot of growth in the relationship, and it's been very positive, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about the challenges that we face across all areas of New Zealand and government and business and across society in terms of our future approaches to China. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the role of cities like Auckland play in this. So obviously there has been rapid growth across all points of the relationship with China in recent years. As Zhang has said, on the trade and economic front, this growth has occurred very rapidly, and it's particularly been the case since the signing of our free trade agreement with China. So as some of you will remember, the China FTA came into force just about exactly the same time as the global financial crisis hit in October 2008. And really the resulting opening of the China market to our exports at that time shielded us very significantly from the worst impacts of that downturn. I mean, just to quote a few figures, although Zhang has already, I think, given us some quite concrete demonstrations of how that trade has developed. Total two-way trade between New Zealand and China has doubled since 2010, and our total exports have actually quadrupled since the signing of the FTA. So China's now our second largest trading partner overall after Australia. It's our largest goods export market. It's our largest source of students. It's our second largest source of tourists. It's our largest source of long-term migrants, and it's a growing source of FDI into the country. So we should really feel good about the relationship with China looking forward. Looking to China into the future, the middle class, we believe, will continue to expand, and with that, so will its demand for the quality goods and services and travel and education abroad that New Zealand has to offer. Chinese companies will continue to seek outward investment opportunities, and China will continue to look for innovation partnerships as it moves up the value chain, and New Zealand is well positioned to take advantage of these. But at the same time, China will have a greater role in government in the Pacific and in regional and in global affairs. And as I said, New Zealand is very well positioned to respond to all of these future developments. We have a good reputation with China, and we work well across a range of sectors and internationally. We also have enduring people-to-people links through our Chinese communities, many of which who are here represented today, and through some iconic connections through people such as Railway Ali. In 2014, we also recognised our relationship with China as a comprehensive strategic partnership. So as we do look ahead, there is a lot of upside. But there are things that we need to improve on. There are things we need to do more of if we want to maintain and to improve New Zealand's position. Because alongside the rapid development of our relationship with China, we are experiencing some very major shifts. Firstly, in recent years, although China's significance to New Zealand has increased dramatically, the reverse is not necessarily true. There is growing competition on the diplomatic and commercial landscape for China's attention. China has a growing network of FTAs with developing countries, which is expanding as well. On the political front, therefore, New Zealand needs to be far more creative about how we maintain the status of our relationship and our advantages with China. On the trade and economic front, there are also challenges. We've always been a victim of our own success. There are some signs now of strain around capacity in our trade with China, and some questions around the sustainability of continuing rapid growth based on increasing volumes in just a few sectors. For example, there's a limit to how much more milk powder we can export to China, and there are limits around the number of tourists that we can have in our country over the peak periods. So I think this is all part of the proposition for New Zealand to start looking to shift its focus, particularly of its export growth to China, to something that's more diverse and led by higher value, not simply higher volumes. There is growing evidence that we are starting to do this, and I think that's a good news story. There is higher value F&B exports going to China, supported by a number of agencies, as well as at the city level. There are growing innovation and technology connections, and there's a concerted push into other areas that are higher value. Such a shift will also require building capacity and capability in key sectors, such as informed public dialogue about our choices for the future, such as the forum we're having today. Continuing success will also depend on our ability to protect and preserve the attributes that we value, that is, the attributes that underpin the New Zealand brand and that attract Chinese to New Zealand. And at a higher level, we also need to ensure that we're achieving balance across different dimensions of the relationship. So these, I think, are questions that maybe during the rest of the forum people can discuss amongst themselves. I now wanted to turn very briefly to the role that subnational relationships can play in all of this, because I think it's a very significant one. So when I say subnational relationships, I basically am talking about sister city connections. Now, sister city connections in New Zealand have not always been taken that seriously, but in China they are taken extremely seriously. Subnational government in China is enormous, and it has a lot of influence. So how do these relationships contribute? Firstly, at a political level, subnational relationships, i.e. sister city relationships, are all about building much broader, deeper and more resilient relationships between government. They actually add a lot of depth to the relationship that we have bilaterally between New Zealand and China. Now, these relationships are also much more focused on positive and tangible outcomes. They don't really have to deal with difficult policy issues in the relationship. So these relationships at the subnational level can be a real ballast, actually, for the broader official relationship. And that's where the depth of the relationship comes into goes to the resilience of the relationship. In terms of so I think that's the first benefit of the subnational relationship. Now, in terms of actual economic benefits, subnational connections also tend to be much closer to the local economy, to real economic connections. So these relationships are actually able to focus far more on individual companies, on SMEs, and let's face it, most of the companies in New Zealand are SMEs, and So in China, subnational governments, because they're so huge and influential, but because they are close to the local economies, they really have a great ability to reach into their local economy and select the best partners for New Zealand. And I think we saw a great example of this at the Tripartite Partnership Conference this year in Auckland. Now, that was the second Tripartite Partnership Conference. The Tripartite, I should say, is a partnership between Auckland, Guangzhou and LA. And one of the reasons it was so successful was because local governments came together. They were not distracted by high-level policy issues, and they were just focused on tangible outcomes for those three cities. This particular partnership has also been very effective in the way it's drawn New Zealand engagement with China, Auckland's engagement with China in particular, into a more sophisticated and higher value area, into more sophisticated and higher value sectors, such as around the services and innovation and technology. So I think this is another way that the subnational relationships really have the ability to push New Zealand into that new area that we want to be in terms of leveraging our brand, in terms of moving to higher value exports, in terms of building capability as well. So I guess in closing, the main point I want to make is that New Zealand has been very successful in its relationship with China. If we want to maintain the momentum and if we want to have a sustainable relationship into the future, though, we really need to think about moving the relationship into a different area. We need to focus on broader and more resilient and more robust relationships. And this is not just the job of the government of the day. This is something that needs to happen across business and society and the subnational level. So in closing, I would just like again to commend the forum organisers. These are the sorts of forums I think that will push the conversation forward in terms of New Zealand looking to its future with China. Thank you.